The Alpha's blood was still warm when she stepped back into the clan that exiled her 15 years ago. The wounds didn't look like an enemy attack. They looked precise, intentional, familiar. And if she's right, the killer isn't outside the walls. So, why did they let her return now? Before the story begins, do me a small favor. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, and it honestly reminds me how far these stories travel. And when a story ends, come back and rate it from 0 to 10. I really want to know how it made you feel. Now let's begin. On the night the Alpha died, the wolves did not howl in grief. They waited, afraid of what would come next. The body of Alpha Lord Zephyrin Maldek lay sprawled beneath the full moon, his blood a dark stain spreading across pristine snow. Torches flickered in the hands of clan warriors who formed a silent circle around their fallen leader, their breaths rising like spirits into the frozen air. Behind them, the ancient stone walls of Belmorn Keep loomed, casting shadows that seemed to swallow the light. It was the silence that struck deepest. In all the histories whispered by firelight, never had a werewolf clan remained mute at the death of their Alpha. The howl was sacred, a release of grief, a proclamation of unity, a promise that the pack endured. But tonight, fear had stolen their voices. Nimra Clithra felt that silence like a weight upon her chest as her horse crested the final hill. 15 years had passed since she had last seen these walls, yet the scent of pine and stone remembered her. She pulled her cloak tighter, the dark fabric concealing the healer's tools at her belt, pouches of herbs, vials of tinctures, bandages wound tight. No sword hung at her side. The monks who had raised her believed knowledge cut deeper than any blade. The clan gates stood open, unguarded. Another sign of disorder. As she dismounted and led her horse through, wolves in human form emerged from the shadows. Elders with gray-streaked hair whispered behind weathered hands, their eyes narrow with suspicion. Younger warriors straightened, hope flickering across their faces like candle flame in wind. Lady Nimra Clithra. The voice cut through the murmurs. She turned. A man stood at the edge of torchlight, tall and broad-shouldered, his face marked by scars that spoke of battles survived. Dark hair fell past his jaw, and his eyes, amber in the firelight, fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Phalar, the Alpha's son. The man to whom she had been promised by oath before she could even understand what promises meant. He approached with measured steps, each movement controlled, deliberate. The warriors parted for him. When he stopped before her, she saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the burden of leadership already settling onto shoulders not yet ready to bear it. "You came," he said quietly. "The oath called me home." Something flickered in his expression, relief, perhaps, or resignation. "Then you've returned to chaos." He gestured toward the body, still surrounded by silent wolves. "My father is dead, and the pack." He paused, jaw tightening. "The pack does not know whether to mourn or run." Nimra followed his gaze to the fallen Alpha. Even from a distance, something troubled her trained eye. She moved forward, ignoring the elder's protests, and knelt beside Zephyrin Maldek's body. The wounds were precise. Too precise. Claw marks raked across his throat, yes, but the angles were wrong. The depth inconsistent. And there, beneath the torn flesh, evidence of calculation rather than rage. She looked up at Phalar, finding him already watching her. "These wounds," she said softly, "were not made by an enemy's fury. They were made by someone who knew exactly where to strike." The torchlight wavered. The silence deepened. And in that moment, Nimra Clithra understood. She had not returned home to heal a grieving clan. She had returned to expose a murderer who walked among them. The memory came unbidden as Nimra knelt in the blood-stained snow. She had been 7 winters old when her mother led her to the Alpha's hall, small hand gripped tight. The great stone chamber had been empty save for Zephyr Maldek and his son, a boy barely older than herself, dark-haired and solemn.
No celebration.
No witnesses beyond the walls themselves. This oath, her mother had whispered, is for balance, not bloodline. Remember that, daughter. The words had made no sense then. They had sworn the promise in silence, Failer's young hand placed over hers, his father's voice binding them with old words. 3 days later, her mother had died under circumstances the clan never fully explained, and Nimra had been sent away to the monks, for her own protection, they said. Now, 15 years later, she understood. The oath had been hidden, because someone had feared it. Lady Nimra. An elder's voice cut through her thoughts. You should not disturb the Alpha's body. She ignored him, her healer's training taking precedence over protocol. Carefully, she examined the wounds across Zephyr Maldek's throat. 4 parallel slashes, consistent with werewolf claws. But the angle was wrong. An attack from the front would leave vertical tears. These ran horizontal, as if the killer had stood behind him. Her fingers traced the edges of the wounds, then paused. There, beneath the torn flesh, faint marks pressed into the skin. Ritual symbols, barely visible in the torchlight. This was no random attack, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. These markings, they're from the old rites. The rite of succession. Murmurs rippled through the gathered wolves. The rite of succession had been forbidden for generations, a brutal practice where challengers could claim leadership through assassination disguised as honor. Phalar crouched beside her, his presence solid and grounding. You're certain? I was taught to read flesh as monks read manuscripts. She met his amber gaze. Your father was murdered by someone who knew the old ways. Someone within the clan. Before Phalar could respond, an elder stepped forward. Goreth, his gray beard braided with bones. The girl speaks blasphemy. She has been gone too long, forgotten our ways. A shout from the eastern wall cut him off. Movement in the trees. The clan warriors tensed, hands moving to weapons. But Phalar raised his hand, commanding stillness. Hold your positions. Do not strike blindly in the dark. Nimra rose, her instincts prickling. Something felt wrong. Too convenient. She began moving toward the guest chambers where she'd been assigned quarters, Phalar falling into step beside her. You should stay with the pack, she said quietly. The oath binds me to protect you. They reached the door to her chambers, just as Nimra heard it, the whisper of steel leaving a sheath. She spun as a cloaked figure lunged from the shadows, blade aimed at her heart. Phalar moved like water, intercepting the assassin with brutal efficiency. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisted, and sent the blade clattering across stone. The figure stumbled back, hood falling to reveal a young warrior. Barely 20 winters, eyes wide with fear. Who sent you? Phalar's voice was iron. The young wolf trembled. They said she would destroy us. That her return meant the end of the old ways. They. Nimra pressed, her healer's mind already cataloging the boy's terror, his manipulation. Who told you this? But the warrior only shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I cannot, they will kill my family. Phalar could have snapped his neck. Ancient law would have demanded it. An attempted assassination required death. Instead, he gestured to 2 guards. Take him to the holding cells. Unharmed. He will speak when he's ready. The warriors hesitated, shocked by the mercy. But they obeyed. As the assassin was led away, Nimra touched Phalar's arm. You broke tradition by sparing him. Tradition, Phalar said quietly, his eyes following the young warrior, has already failed us once tonight. Perhaps it's time we tried something else. In the torchlight, Nimra saw what others might have missed, the doubt flickering behind Phalar's controlled exterior, the weight of choosing a different path than his father's. And she realized that the oath binding them might be the only thing standing between the clan and civil war. Dawn broke cold and gray over Belmorn, but the great hall blazed with torchlight and rage. Blood demands blood. Elder Goratha's voice thundered through the stone chamber, fist slamming against the ancient oak table. Around him, other gray-bearded elders nodded, their faces carved from years of war and tradition. The Alpha is dead. We must strike at our enemies before they strike again. Which enemies? A young warrior named Karen stood from the opposite side of the hall, his voice sharp with frustration. We don't even know who killed him. You would have us attack blindly. We attack as wolves have always attacked, with strength, with fury. Goratha's eyes blazed amber. Not with questions and doubt. The hall erupted into shouting. Younger wolves surged to their feet, arguing for patience, for answers. The elders roared them down, invoking ancient laws, old victories won through violence and instinct. Phalar stood at the head of the table, silent, his jaw tight. Nimra watched from the shadows near the doorway, observing how the pack fractured along invisible lines, age against youth, tradition against change, fear against hope. Phalar. Gorath turned on him, his voice cutting through the chaos. You are Alpha now, whether you've claimed it or not. Show them strength. Show them you are your father's son. Declare vengeance. All eyes turned to Phalar. The weight of expectation hung like smoke in the air. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Nimra stepped forward into the light. May I speak? The hall fell silent.
Shocked.
A woman, a healer who had been gone for 15 years, daring to address the council. Goratha's lip curled. This is not a place for soft hands and herb knowledge, girl. No, Nimra said calmly, moving to stand beside Phalar. It is a place for leadership, and leadership requires more than rage. She turned to address the entire assembly, her voice steady, clear. Your Alpha lies dead, murdered by someone who knew him, who knew the old rites. You would have Phalar lead you into battle against shadows? Against ghosts. We would have him lead us like a wolf, an elder spat. Then you would have him fail, as his father failed. The words fell like stones. Zephyr Maldek died because someone close to him betrayed him. Someone in this very hall, perhaps. She let that sink in, watching faces shift. Strike blindly, and you may kill your own. Or worse, you may let the true murderer hide behind your rage. Karen stepped forward. What do you propose, Lady Nimra? Investigation. Evidence. Truth. She met Goratha's glare without flinching. Give me 3 days to examine what happened, to question witnesses, to follow the trail of facts rather than fury. 3 days? Gorath laughed bitterly. 3 days for our enemies to prepare, to attack again. 3 days. Phalar's voice cut through, firm and final. Lady Nimra speaks with wisdom. We will investigate. The elders erupted in protest, but Phalar raised his hand. When silence fell, Goratha's smile was cold and calculated. Very well. 3 days for your investigation. He leaned forward. But know this, the full moon rises in 7 nights. And on that moon, you will face the trial of claws to claim true leadership. Mercy will not save you there, boy. Only strength. The pronouncement hung in the air like a sentence of death. Nimra felt Phalar tense beside her, but his expression remained controlled, unreadable. I accept, he said quietly. As the council dispersed, murmuring and uneasy, Nimra understood the trap that had been laid. They had 3 days to seek truth. But in 7, Phalar would have to prove himself the old way, through violence and dominance. And she had no idea if he would survive it. The Alpha study remained untouched, as if Zephyr Maldek might walk through the door at any moment. Nimra ran her fingers along the spines of ancient ledgers, searching for anything that might reveal who had wanted him dead. Moonlight filtered through narrow windows, casting silver across scattered parchments. She heard him before she saw him. The quiet footsteps, the controlled breath. Phalar stood in the doorway, still wearing the leather and steel from the council meeting, but his shoulders sagged with a weight no armor could bear. "You should rest," Nimra said gently. "The trial is 7 days away. I won't survive it." The words came raw, unguarded. Not the way they expect me to. Nimra turned to face him fully. In the moonlight, he looked younger somehow, less like the hardened warrior and more like the solemn boy who had clasped her hand 15 years ago. "Your father." Phalar moved into the room, his hands clenching and unclenching. He ruled through fear. The pack obeyed because they were terrified of his rage, his strength. He never asked for counsel, never admitted doubt. He met her eyes. He died alone, Nimra. Murdered by someone close to him because no one trusted him enough to warn him of danger. And you fear becoming him. I fear I already am. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Every time I want to listen, I hear his voice telling me listening is weakness. Every time I show mercy, I see the elders' contempt. What if they're right? What if leadership requires becoming a monster? Nimra crossed the space between them, her healer's instinct recognizing a different kind of wound, one carved by expectation and legacy. "May I tell you what the monks taught me about leadership?" He nodded, desperate for an answer that didn't end in blood. "True leadership," she began, settling onto the edge of her father's desk, "begins with listening. Not to show weakness, but to gather wisdom. A leader who cannot hear his people will lead them off a cliff while they scream warnings he ignores." Phalar leaned against the wall, his attention fixed on her words like a man dying of thirst. "Second, accountability. My teachers said a leader must answer for his choices, not hide behind tradition or authority. When you spared that young assassin, you took responsibility for showing mercy. That takes more strength than killing." The elders would disagree. "The elders," Nimra said carefully, "are afraid of you becoming something they cannot control. A leader who thinks for himself." She rose, moving to a shelf of ledgers. "And third, emotional restraint. Not suppressing what you feel, but understanding it before you act." Her fingers found a worn journal, its pages marked with her father's hand. "Rage is easy, Phalar. Rage requires no thought. But wisdom? That requires you to feel your fury and still choose the harder path." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, "You make it sound possible. Because it is." She opened the journal, scanning entries from months before Zephrin's death. Her breath caught. "Phalar, look at this." He moved beside her, close enough that she felt the warmth of him, the solid presence that somehow made the cold room feel safer. His shoulder brushed hers as he read over her hand. The entry was dated 3 moons prior. "Gorth speaks of the old ways, with too much fervor. He gathers supporters among the elders, those who resent the peace we've built. I fear he would drag us back to the blood feuds, back to the days when we were monsters instead of guardians. Must watch him closely." "He knew," Nimra breathed. "Your father knew Gorth was dangerous." Phalar's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady, controlled, as she had taught him. "Then Gorth has been planning this. Planning to replace one alpha with another he can control." She turned to face him and found his amber eyes already on her, something shifting in their depths, gratitude, trust, something more fragile she dared not name. "The moon trial," Phalar said quietly. "If I refuse to kill my challenger, the elders will call me weak. But if I kill him, you become what they want, not what the pack needs." Nimra held his gaze. "You must find a third way." His hand rose, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, a gesture so careful it made her heart stumble. "Will you help me find it?" "That," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "is what the oath demands. Partnership, not servitude." For the first time since she'd returned, Phalar smiled, small, genuine, and full of something that looked remarkably like hope. The full moon hung bloated and silver above the stone circle, casting harsh light across the packed snow. Every member of the Belmorn clan had gathered in the ancient ritual ground, a natural amphitheater carved by time and tradition. Torches blazed in iron brackets, their flames dancing like hungry spirits. Nimra stood among the crowd, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. She had spent 3 days gathering evidence, questioning witnesses, piecing together Goratha's conspiracy. But none of it mattered if Phalar died tonight. The elders sat on elevated stones, Gorath at their center, his expression carved from satisfaction and certainty. He had chosen the challenger well, Rakan, a mountain of a warrior, scarred and brutal, known for ending fights quickly and without mercy. A horn sounded, low and mournful. Phalar entered the circle from the east, stripped to the waist despite the cold, his breath misting in the frigid air. Scars crossed his chest and shoulders, a map of survival. He wore no armor, carried no weapon. The trial of claws required only what nature provided. Rakan entered from the west, twice Phalar's width, his hands already shifting into claws, bones cracking and reforming. A partial transformation, legal under trial law, devastating in practice. The challenge is clear. Goratha's voice rang out. Leadership through strength, victory through dominance. The wolf who stands alone claims the pack. The gathered wolves howled, the sound finally released after days of silence. It echoed off stone and sky, primal and hungry. The horn sounded again. Rakan charged. He moved with terrifying speed for his size, claws extended, aiming for Phalar's throat. But Phalar sidestepped, his movements economical, controlled. Rakan's claws whistled past, finding only air. The fight became a brutal dance. Rakan attacked with raw power, each strike capable of killing. Phalar defended with precision, reading his opponent's patterns, waiting for the opening he knew would come. It came when Rakan overextended, putting too much weight behind a downward slash. Phalar caught his wrist, twisted, and drove his knee into Rakan's ribs. Bone cracked audibly. The larger warrior stumbled. Phalar pressed his advantage. A strike to the temple. A sweep that took Rakan's legs. Within heartbeats, Phalar had him pinned, one hand around his throat, the other pulled back with claws extended. The killing blow. Tradition demanded it. The crowd held its breath. Phalar's amber eyes found Nimra's across the circle. In them, she saw the struggle. Every lesson his father had beaten into him, warring against everything she had taught him. Fear against hope. Violence against wisdom. She gave the smallest nod. Phalar's claws retracted. He released Rakan's throat and stood, stepping back. "I will not kill a wolf of Belmorn," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. Not to prove strength. Not to satisfy tradition. Rakan fought with honor. He lives with honor. The silence was absolute. Not even breath disturbed it. Gorath rose, his face twisted with rage. "You show weakness. You shame your father's memory. You." "He shows wisdom." Nimra stepped into the circle, her voice clear and steady. Every eye turned to her. The covenant of the first moon, written before any here were born, states, "The alpha who preserves his pack grows stronger than the alpha who devours it." Phalar has proven his strength by winning. He has proven his wisdom by restraining that strength. She moved to stand beside Phalar, facing the elders. "You wanted to see if he could win. He won. You wanted to see if he could kill. Instead, he showed you something greater, that he can choose when not to." Goratha's lips pulled back from his teeth. "The girl speaks." "The girl," interrupted Karen, stepping forward from the crowd, "speaks truth." Another young warrior joined him, then another, and another. The pack began to shift, not in their bodies, but in their allegiance. The younger wolves moving forward, surrounding Phalar and Nimra in a protective circle. Even some of the older warriors, those tired of blood, tired of fear, stepped away from the Elder's stones. Rakan pushed himself to his feet, cradling his broken ribs. For a long moment, he stared at Phalar. Then, slowly, deliberately, he bowed his head in submission. "You are Alpha," Rakan said, his voice rough. "And I am yours to command." The howl started with Karen, a long, powerful note of acceptance. Others joined, then more, until the stone circle rang with the sound of a pack uniting. Gorath remained on his stone, silent and seething, as the clan acknowledged what he had tried to prevent. Phalar had won the trial. But more than that, he had begun to change what it meant to lead. The nights following the trial, Nimra and Phalar moved through Belmorn like shadows, speaking to those who would not speak in daylight. In the healer's quarters, an elderly woman named Mira finally broke her silence. Her hands trembled as she poured tea, steam rising between them like confessions taking form. "The night before the Alpha died," she whispered, glancing toward the door, "Elder Gorath came to me. Said he needed sleeping herbs for old wounds troubling him." She paused. But Gorath has never had trouble sleeping. And the amount he requested, it was enough to drop a bear. Phalar leaned forward. "You gave them to him?" "I had no choice. To refuse an elder." Myra's voice cracked. "But I've carried the weight since. If I had been braver—" "You're brave now," Nimra said gently, covering the woman's shaking hand with her own. "That's what matters." They found other threads. A young scout named Tavin admitted he'd been ordered by Gorath to abandon his post on the eastern perimeter the night of the murder, the same perimeter Zephyrin patrolled alone. A kitchen worker reported seeing Gorath burning documents in the hours after the Alpha's death. Back in Zephyrin's study, Nimra spread her findings across the desk like pieces of a broken mirror, each one reflecting part of a terrible truth. Patrol schedules marked in Gorath's hand. Healing records showing he'd obtained sedatives. Witness accounts of his movements. "He orchestrated everything," she said, her finger tracing the timeline. "The sleeping herbs to dull your father's senses. The abandoned patrol, so no one would witness. The ritual markings to make it look like an enemy attack." Phalar's jaw tightened. "A man we trusted. A man my father trusted." "That's how betrayal works," Nimra replied quietly. "It wears the face of loyalty until the moment it strikes." A soft knock interrupted them. Karen entered, his expression grim. "My lord, my lady, Gorath has called an emergency council meeting at dawn. He's demanding Phalar step down, claiming the pack is divided under his leadership." Nimra and Phalar exchanged glances. They had the evidence, but Gorath was making his move before they could present it. "He knows," Phalar said. Nimra nodded. "Which means he's desperate. And desperate wolves are the most dangerous." What they didn't see was the shadow that had been pressed against the corridor wall outside the study. What they didn't hear were the footsteps retreating into darkness, carrying word of their investigation straight to the one who had the most to lose. In his chambers, Gorath received the news with cold calculation. The girl and the full Alpha had connected the pieces. But he had not survived this long by allowing others to control the narrative. If they wanted to expose him at dawn, he would simply ensure dawn never came for one of them. He reached for a sealed message, already prepared. The second phase of his plan was about to begin. Dawn arrived cold and clear, the great hall packed with every wolf of Belmorn. Torches blazed along the stone walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed to hold their breath. Gorath stood at the Elder's table, his voice booming with manufactured authority. "Phalar has shown weakness. The pack suffers division under his. The pack suffers from lies." Nimra's voice cut through his speech like a blade through silk. She stepped forward, carrying a leather satchel, Phalar at her side. "And it's time the truth was spoken. Goratha's eyes narrowed. You overstep, girl. Elder Gorath. Nimra's voice remained steady, clinical. On the night of Alpha Zephrin's death, you obtained enough sleeping herbs from healer Mira to sedate a grown wolf. Would you care to explain why? The hall went silent. Mira rose from the crowd, trembling but resolute. It's true. He told me it was for old wounds, but I knew it was wrong. Lies from a frightened old woman. Gorath spat. Then explain this. Nimra produced the patrol schedule. You personally reassigned Scout Tavin from the eastern perimeter, the exact location where Zephyrin died, hours before the murder. Tavin stood. He ordered me to leave my post. Said it was by the Alpha's command, but I never received confirmation. Goratha's composure cracked slightly. Coincidence. I will not. And this. Phalar held up his father's journal, open to the damning entry. He read aloud. Gorath speaks of the old ways with too much fervor. I fear he would drag us back to the blood feuds. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Goratha's face darkened, but Nimra wasn't finished. The ritual markings on Zephrin's body matched the rite of succession, a practice outlawed generations ago. Only the eldest among us would remember those symbols. She stepped closer to Gorath. You killed him because he was leading us toward peace. Because he trusted me, a healer who believed in wisdom over violence. You feared losing the power that comes from keeping the pack afraid. Enough. Gorath roared, his control finally shattering. Yes, I killed him because he was weak. Because he would have made us all weak. His eyes blazed with fanatic certainty. The old ways kept us strong, kept us wolves. But he wanted to turn us into sheep, led by a girl with herb knowledge and pretty words. The confession hung in the air, damning and absolute. Phalar's voice was quiet, but it carried. You murdered my father not for the pack's strength, but for your own fear of change. Gorath had no response. The truth had stripped him bare. The sentence for murdering an alpha is death. One elder said quietly. No. Phalar shook his head. Exile. Let him live with what he's done, removed from the pack he claimed to protect. Death would make him a martyr to those who share his beliefs. Exile makes him an example of what happens when power corrupts. Slowly, deliberately, wolves began to bow their heads to Phalar. Not in fear, but in recognition. Not because he had dominated them, but because he had earned their trust. Gorath was led away in chains. His reign of fear ended not by violence, but by the one thing he'd feared most. Truth spoken in daylight. Phalar was Alpha. Not by blood, not by force, but by consent. The full moon rose again over Belmorn, but this time the stone circle held no trial, no violence. The pack gathered for the bonding oath, the ceremony that would formally unite their alpha with his chosen mate. Nimra stood at the circle's center, the moonlight painting her in silver. Around her, wolves waited with attention born not of fear, but anticipation. The oath sworn in secret 15 years ago would finally be spoken aloud. Phalar approached from the east, wearing the Alpha's mantle, dark leather worked with symbols of protection, not conquest. When he reached her, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he simply looked at her, and in his amber eyes, she saw everything they'd survived together. The old oath, Nimra began, her voice carrying to every gathered wolf, was sworn in secrecy because those in power feared what it represented. She turned to address the pack. My mother told me it was for balance, not bloodline. I didn't understand until I returned home and saw what imbalance had created. Fear, division, murder. She faced Phalar again. The oath was never meant to chain us together through duty. It was meant to remind us that a pack needs more than strength to survive. It needs wisdom, healing, the courage to choose restraint over rage. For 15 years, Phalar said quietly, I believed leadership meant dominance. that showing emotion was weakness, that mercy was failure. His hand found hers. You taught me that true strength lies in knowing when not to strike. That a leader who only knows how to destroy will eventually destroy everything he loves. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of transformation. I was born to this oath, Phalar continued, his voice rough with emotion. But I choose it now. Not because tradition demands it, not because my father arranged it, but because you showed me what I could become instead of what I feared I was. Nimra felt tears threaten, but her voice remained steady. And I choose you. Not the alpha, not the warrior, but the man who learned that leadership is not inherited. It's earned through every choice to be better than the darkness that came before. They clasped hands, and the pack witnessed something they hadn't seen in generations, an oath given freely, in love rather than obligation. As if responding to that choice, the instincts that had made the full moon dangerous seemed to quiet. The wolves remained in human form, their connection to each other strengthened not by the beast within, but by the bond they witnessed. Karen was the first to howl, a long, joyous note of celebration. Others joined, young and old, until the stone circle rang with unity. Not the fearful silence of Zephyr's death, not the uncertain howls of the trial, but something new, a pack singing together because they finally understood what they were protecting. Phalar pulled Nimra close, his forehead resting against hers. Together? Together, she whispered back. And under the full moon that had once demanded blood, they chose love instead. Spring came to Belmorn, melting the snow that had witnessed so much blood and transformation. In the great hall, Phalar stood before a gathering unlike any the clan had seen, a council where elders sat beside young warriors, where healers spoke with equal authority to fighters. The old laws served us once, Phalar announced, his voice carrying the confidence of earned leadership. But we are not the wolves our ancestors were. We protect humanity's borders not through fear, but through strength tempered by wisdom. He gestured to Nimra, who stood beside him, not behind, not in shadow, but as equal. From this day, Belmorn operates through council decision, not single decree. No alpha will rule alone. Transparency replaces secrecy. Questions replace blind obedience. Mira, the elderly healer, stepped forward. And healers will sit on this council, with authority to stop actions that endanger the pack's well-being. Karen raised his fist. Violence becomes our last option, not our first instinct. The reforms were voted upon, discussed, refined. It took hours, sometimes became heated, but that was the point. Engagement over submission, participation over fear. Outside, in the training grounds transformed into learning circles, Nimra taught young wolves what the monks had taught her. Not just healing, but conflict resolution, emotional regulation, critical thinking. She watched them absorb lessons their parents had never learned, saw them question instead of simply accepting. Why did Elder Gorith kill the alpha? A young wolf named Sarah asked during one session. Because he was afraid, Nimra answered honestly. Afraid of losing power. Afraid of change. Fear makes people dangerous when they don't understand their own emotions. But Alpha Phalar was afraid too, another youth observed. He told us during the council meeting. Yes. Nimra smiled. The difference is, Phalar acknowledged his fear and chose to act with wisdom anyway. That's courage, not the absence of fear, but the choice to not let it control you. As the full moon rose that night, Nimra and Phalar stood on the eastern wall, watching the pack gather below. The wolves howled, not in mourning, not in uncertainty, but in celebration of what they'd become. Do you think it will last? Phalar asked quietly, his hand finding hers. Not without work, Nimra replied. Peace requires constant tending, but we've given them the tools to maintain it. Below, the young wolves howled alongside the old, And in that harmony, Belmorn found its new voice. Phalar pulled her close, and in the moonlight that had once illuminated only death and fear, they saw possibility instead. Strength without wisdom destroys, Nimra whispered, repeating the lesson her mother had taught her long ago. Wisdom without courage falters, Phalar added, the words he'd learned through trial and transformation. Together, they spoke the final truth, but together they endure. And under the watchful moon, the pack, reborn through pain, united through choice, held their agreement into the night. If you stayed until the end, thank you truly. Stories like this don't survive unless people choose to stay, choose to care, and choose to be part of something bigger than themselves. Subscribing isn't just support for this channel, it's a choice to keep stories about courage, truth, and unity alive. Don't disappear quietly. Join the pack. One subscriber at a time. We're building something that refuses to let fear win.